Hey everyone. So this is going to be a slightly different video than normal because as you can see you are not looking at me, you are looking at, in this case, the first stanza of John Keats' Ode on a Grecian Urn. So this video is going to look closely, or somewhat closely, at John Keats, who's one of, or probably actually the greatest of the Romantic poets. And I'm also going to model in the course of this video how to do a close reading. And I'll talk to you a bit more about that when we get to that part of the video. But first, a little bit about why Keats is such an important poet. So, as I said, Keats is probably the archetypal Romantic poet. He was a genius. There's not really a better way of saying it, I think. He started poetry after he had been apprenticed to be a doctor, and he was spectacular at it. Within a year of starting his poetic career, he was writing some of the greatest masterpieces in the history of English poetry. He was also very romantic in the sense that his whole life, but his whole poetic career was overshadowed by this sort of feeling of impending doom. So there's a strain of melancholy that runs throughout his work, and indeed if you decide to do the readings for the melancholy thematic for week 2 of the Romantics, you'll read a lot more Keats than this. But Keats did in fact die quite young. He died at 26, and by the time that he stopped writing poetry at 24, he had produced some of the greatest masterpieces in the history of the English language, certainly, but the history of world poetry as well. One of those being Ode on a Grecian Urn. So Keats is this fantastically important writer. He was a member of, or he was at least a fellow traveler with what's called the Cockney School of Poetry, which basically was a sort of derogatory name given to this group of poets that critics felt were above their social station in the way that they tried to write. But Keats also, the other sort of big thing to know about Keats, and I had you guys read his letter to his brothers, in which he sort of introduces this idea of negative capability. Negative capability is Keats's big sort of poetic innovation or philosophical innovation, and it's one of the key ideas of the Romantic era. And in a nutshell, what negative capability is the ability to appreciate not knowing, or the ability to appreciate being in a condition of uncertainty about something. And as Keats says in the letter that you guys should have read for this week, the opposite of this would be someone like Coleridge, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who Keats says could never just sort of accept a problem, accept uncertainty. Like, he had to find answers. So Keats celebrates this idea of negative capability and being able to be uncertain and to find meaning in that uncertainty. And we'll see that somewhat in this poem, Ode on a Grecian Urn. So at this point I'm going to sort of switch gears and go to the close reading of this poem. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with this, a close reading is a literary technique that we get from a movement called the New Critics. And the New Critics worked primarily in the 1950s and 60s, and then they sort of got eclipsed, I suppose. But the thing that we keep from the New Critics, because basically what they believed is that the only thing that you need to know about a text, or the only thing you need to know to understand a text, is what is there on the page. And so people like feminists and post-colonialists and critical race theorists and things like this said, no, you need social context, and now pretty much everybody agrees that you need to know some social context to understand any piece of literature. But the new critics thought that what was on the page was sufficient, and so they gave us this technique called close reading, which essentially involves paying close critical attention to the words on the page to determine meaning through the techniques used by writers to convey meaning. So, to do a close reading, to do this as an activity, one thing that you need to have is a thesis. And my thesis is written at the top of the page here, which you probably can't read too well. But basically my thesis for the close reading of Ode on a Grecian Urn is that Keats uses a subtle irony to express his melancholy and foreboding about an early death. So Keats is centrally concerned here, I argue, with his own impending doom, and again, he dies very young. He dies of illness, and I think this poem is a sort of meditation on that. So two things I want us to take note of before we get to the actual sort of nuts and bolts of the poem. This is an ekphrastic poem. An ekphrastic poem is a poem written in response to an external object. So in this case, this poem was inspired by and written to a Grecian urn. And that's significant, and I'll talk about why in a little bit. This is also a lyric poem, which means that this is written like a song. So we can see that in the fact that it has a rhyme scheme. I mean, if we look at the first quatrain here, there's A, B, A, B. Quietness rhymes with express, so that's A, A. Time rhymes with rhyme, A, B, B. So we've got this rhyme scheme. We've got a regular stanza length. We've got regular meter. We've got a regular rhythm and all this stuff. So when we start in on the actual poem itself, we can begin to see some of the irony that I'm talking about in the thesis right off the bat in stanza 1. So Keats opens the poem with, "Thou still unravished bride of quietness, thou foster child of silence and slow time, sylvan historian, who canst thus express a flowery tale more sweetly than our rhyme?" So we've got here initially a couple of important references to sound and expression, because this Grecian urn, as we find out, depicts a group of, I guess, shepherds, shepherdesses, and so on in, the dales of Arcadia, which is in Greece, and essentially Keats is evoking the sound of the songs that they are playing. So we've got musicians, we've got pipes and timbrels here in the last line of stanza 1. So this is all about music. This is all about sound. And again, this is a lyric poem, so we've got this initial connection between the content of Ode on a Grecian Urn and the form of the poem. There's this connection, this thematic connection with music. So we've got pipes and timbrels being depicted, we've got Keats's rhyme, and then we've got expression through silence. And this is a significant point, particularly as we go into stanza 2, which reads, "Heard melodies are sweet, but those unheard are sweeter. Therefore ye soft pipes play on, not to the sensual ear, but more endeared, pipe to the spirit ditties of no tone. Fair youth, beneath the trees thou canst not leave thy song." So, I've made a couple of notes here about this. Incidentally, I want you guys to take note of this. I've annotated this poem, and this is really what you guys should be doing with all of the works that we're reading this semester, because this helps you figure out what's going on, what's important, and then if you decide to write about this piece, the annotations that you make will help you figure out what you want to say. But we've got, again, this, so back to the poem, we've got, again, this reference to silent music. Those melodies unheard are sweeter. pipes playing not to the sensual ear, but to the spirit. So these are silenced these are silenced songs. These are songs that are always potential. And this is where we start to get into negative capability to a certain degree, because these songs are always in existence, but they're always silent. And in a way, Keats finds this very beautiful, but I think it's also terrifying. And I think this line here, "Fair youth, beneath the trees thou canst not leave thy song," lines 15 and the beginning of 16, I think this is a particularly important line because, again, it ties... I don't think you can see that very well, that note there. It says, "Immortal youth, ironic foreboding." So this ties the notion of art and immortality together, and we get this throughout the poem, but this ties the notion of art and immortality together, but it also ties it to impossibility. It ties it to this sort of living death condition that I think Keats is really anticipating here for himself. So I think that what we're getting here in these lines, melodies unheard are sweeter, fair youth, beneath the trees thou canst not leave thy song, we're getting the sort of beginnings of Keats's own fears about his death. Fears about all of the poems he will never get to write. And we come back to this really in stanza 3, when we get to lines 23 and 24. "And happy melodist unwearied, forever piping songs forever new." Again, we've got this notion of eternity, this notion of living forever, but living forever in a kind of living death. Always new songs, always songs, but never heard. So, I mean, and I've written here, "The lyric poet is never silenced by death, but always silenced by the condition of immortality." And I think this is the sort of poetic theme that Keats is developing here. And so, in a way, I mean, because, again, this is a lyric poem, so this is a song. Happy melodist unwearied, we can imagine being a sort of note to himself, being addressed to Keats himself, forever piping songs forever new, this sort of hope of poetic eternity. So if we go on then to stanza 4, stanza 4 actually has sort of the least useful information in terms of this close reading that I'm developing, but it takes us in a slightly different direction with the pastoral. And the Romantics love pastoral poetry. They love sort of ruined castles and things like this, and sort of rustic settings. So that's what we get in stanza 4. Not a big deal in terms of this particular argument, but there's definitely other arguments to be made about it. However, in stanza 5, we come back to this sort of theme of silence, eternity, loss, and stasis, I guess. "Thou silent form dost tease us out of thought as doth eternity. Cold pastoral, when old age shall this generation waste, thou shalt remain in midst of other woe." So, I mean, we've got here, again, this sort of, these connections, thematic connections between silence, eternity, anticipation of decay in this generation wasting, but then "thou shalt remain in midst of other woe." And this is the address to art. I mean, this is Keats talking directly to the Grecian Urn, but I think we can also understand this as Keats talking to his own poem. And as I've written here, art is a form of eternity, and this is actually a theme that has run throughout poetry, is that by composing verse, by putting ideas into verse, one gains a kind of eternity. So that, for me, is Keats's Ode on a Grecian Urn. I mean, I think he uses the irony of giving voice to a silent urn through his poem. He uses that irony, creating a lyric to take the place of the silent music of the Grecian urn, and through this he explores his own fears about death and his own desire for some kind of artistic immortality.